Death stalked the gray waters beneath scattered clouds. The North Atlantic stretched endless and cold on May 22, 1943. High above the steel-colored waves, a young pilot adjusted his headset and scanned the horizon. Lieutenant William Drain peered through his cockpit window. His Grumman Avenger cut through the morning air. Below him, the ocean held secrets. Somewhere in those depths, German submarines were hunting Allied ships. This moment would change everything in the longest battle of World War II. For nearly 4 years, the Battle of the Atlantic had consumed lives and ships. German U-boats terrorized Allied convoys. They sent merchant vessels to the ocean floor with ruthless efficiency. Precious cargo disappeared beneath the waves. Thousands of sailors never saw home again. But 1943 brought a shift in the deadly game. The hunters were becoming the hunted. A small escort carrier named USS Bogue prowled these dangerous waters. She was half the size of her fleet carrier sisters. Her mission was revolutionary. Instead of protecting convoys, Bogue hunted submarines. She led America's first dedicated hunter-killer group. Her aircraft were writing new rules for anti-submarine warfare. Every flight was an experiment. Every engagement taught deadly lessons. German Admiral Karl Dönitz had launched Operation Drumbeat in January 1942. His submarines found American coastal waters virtually undefended. The attacks were systematic and devastating. U-boats struck with impunity along the eastern seaboard. The German submarine force represented naval excellence. Each boat required months of construction. Millions of Reichsmarks funded their creation. Germany's finest naval personnel manned these steel sharks. These weren't desperate gamblers. They were professional warriors who had perfected their deadly craft. By early 1943, German submarines had destroyed over 14 million tons of Allied shipping. The numbers were staggering, but American industrial might was awakening. The massive production capacity that would overwhelm the Axis powers was beginning to show itself. Small shipyards that had never built anything larger than fishing boats now constructed escort carriers. Liberty ships rolled off production lines at impossible speeds. American ingenuity created new weapons designed specifically to hunt submarines. USS Bogue embodied this industrial transformation. Originally planned as a merchant vessel called Steel Advocate, she was converted during construction. At just over 500 feet long, she displaced 11,000 tons. Fleet carriers like Enterprise dwarfed her. But purpose mattered more than size. Captain Giles Short commanded this revolutionary ship. He understood that Bogue represented something entirely new. Traditional naval doctrine kept aircraft carriers far from danger. They required massive escorts. Bogue would operate with just a handful of destroyers. She would deliberately seek the most dangerous waters in the Atlantic. Her air group consisted of 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 9 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. These aircraft carried modifications specifically for submarine hunting. Avengers loaded depth charges, sonobuoys, and a weapon few people knew existed. The Mark 24 Fido homing torpedo was a closely guarded secret. Unlike conventional torpedoes that traveled straight lines, this weapon could think. It listened for submarine engines. It steered itself toward targets. To German submarine commanders, it seemed like magic. One moment, they felt safe in the depths. The next moment, a thinking torpedo was hunting them. But technology alone wouldn't win this battle. The men flying these missions were often barely out of flight training. They faced an enemy that had been perfecting submarine warfare since 1939. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Peterson had been flying civilian aircraft for only 2 years when Pearl Harbor changed his world. Within months, he found himself learning to land on a pitching carrier deck in the North Atlantic. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Miss the arresting cables and crash into the barrier. Come in too slow and stall into the ocean. The psychological pressure was enormous. These pilots fought more than just the enemy. They battled the ocean itself. A mechanical failure could leave them floating in life rafts. Navigation errors meant certain death. They would drift hundreds of miles from land. Freezing water surrounded them. Prowling U-boats hunted in the same waters. German submarine commanders were adapting to new threats. The days of surfacing to attack convoys in daylight were ending. Allied radar was becoming sophisticated. Air cover expanded constantly. The famous wolf pack tactics that terrorized convoys in 1942 were becoming suicidal. Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann commanded U-569. He had survived 18 months of patrol duty in the North Atlantic. His submarine had sunk 6 Allied vessels totaling over 30,000 tons. By May 1943, submarine commanders called him an old hand. Hartmann understood how deadly his profession had become. The odds were shifting against German submarines. Intelligence reports spoke of new Allied tactics. Mysterious aircraft attacks came from nowhere. U-boats simply vanished without sending distress signals. The Atlantic was becoming a graveyard for submarines as well as merchant ships. On the morning of May 22nd, Hartmann ran on the surface. His batteries were recharging. He was making good time toward his patrol area. Weather was clear. Visibility was excellent. His lookouts scanned the horizon continuously. Standard procedure called for immediate crash diving if aircraft appeared. But the open ocean seemed empty. High above, Lieutenant Drain searched methodically in a grid pattern. His Avenger carried the latest radar equipment. The technology was primitive by later standards. Detecting submarines required favorable conditions, sharp eyes, and considerable luck. The ocean was vast. A submarine presented a target barely larger than a whale. At precisely 10:47 hours, Drain's radar operator called out a contact. Bearing 270 degrees. Range approximately 8 miles. It could have been anything. Debris floating on the surface. A whale surfacing to breathe. Another aircraft in the distance. But as Drain adjusted his heading and descended for visual confirmation, his heart began to race. A thin white wake cut through the blue-black water. The wake was perfectly straight, unmistakably artificial. At the head of that wake was something that made Drain's pulse quicken. The distinctive silhouette of a German U-boat running at high speed on the surface. Time seemed suspended. Here were 2 killing machines about to engage in mortal combat. The submarine represented German naval technology at its peak. A steel shark capable of striking from the depths and disappearing without trace. The aircraft embodied American industrial innovation, mass-produced yet sophisticated, operated by a pilot who had been a civilian just months before. Each represented their nation's military doctrine and industrial might. Hartmann's lookout spotted the aircraft almost immediately. Standard procedure was simple and had saved countless submarines. Dive immediately. Go deep. Stay quiet until the threat passed. Something went wrong in those crucial seconds. Perhaps the dive alarm malfunctioned. Perhaps a valve stuck open. Perhaps the crew, exhausted after weeks at sea, reacted just a fraction too slowly. By the time U-569 began her emergency dive, Drain was already lining up his attack run. He could see figures scrambling on the submarine's deck. Men raced to get below before their boat disappeared beneath the surface. The conning tower was already awash when Drain released his first depth charge. What followed was a deadly game of 3-dimensional chess. Submarines could hide in the ocean's depths, but they needed to surface eventually for air and battery power. Aircraft could cover vast areas quickly, but they carried limited fuel and ordnance. Each side had advantages the other sought to exploit. Each had vulnerabilities the enemy tried to find. The depth charge exploded approximately 50 feet from U-569's pressure hull. The concussion was devastating. Inside the submarine, men were thrown against bulkheads. The boat shuddered and twisted violently. Light bulbs shattered throughout the vessel. Gauges cracked under the pressure. The terrible sound of rending metal echoed through every compartment. Hartmann knew immediately that his boat was mortally wounded. Seawater poured through ruptured seams. Electrical systems began failing throughout the submarine. The ballast tanks had suffered damage. Controlled diving was now impossible. Hartmann had perhaps minutes before his submarine would sink beyond any hope of recovery. The decision that followed would haunt submarine commanders for the rest of the war. He ordered his crew to surface and abandon ship. It was every U-boat captain's nightmare scenario, being caught on the surface, helpless against air attack. Nowhere to hide in the vast expanse of ocean. No escape from the aircraft circling overhead like vultures. As U-569 broke the surface for the last time, her crew began the desperate process of scuttling their own vessel. Demolition charges were set throughout the submarine. Men in life jackets prepared to abandon the boat that had been their home for months. Lieutenant Drain circled overhead, watching the human drama unfold below. His mission was clear: sink enemy submarines. But seeing the human cost of war playing out beneath him left him deeply shaken. These weren't faceless enemies in some distant propaganda film. These were young men, many probably his same age. They were fighting for their lives in the middle of an endless ocean. The reality of war was different from the sanitized versions in newsreels. The scuttling charges detonated with a dull roar that could be heard for miles. U-569 disappeared beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. She took with her all the secrets of her construction. Her intelligence files vanished into the depths. Her codebooks would never be recovered. 24 members of her 47-man crew survived to be rescued. The Canadian destroyer HMCS Skeena pulled them from the frigid water. They would spend the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. This engagement represented far more than another submarine sinking. It marked the maturation of American anti-submarine tactics. It signaled the beginning of the end for the German U-boat offensive. Hunter-killer groups were proving that the vast Atlantic could be patrolled effectively. Submarines could be hunted down and destroyed far from convoy routes. The ocean was no longer a safe haven for German boats. For the German Kriegsmarine, losing U-569 was part of a disturbing pattern. May 1943 would later be known as Black May in German submarine circles. 41 U-boats were lost that month, more than had been sunk in any previous month of the war. The casualty rate was becoming unsustainable for German naval command. Admiral Dönitz was forced to confront a harsh reality. His submarine force was being systematically destroyed. The technological advantages that had given U-boats their early success were being neutralized. Allied innovations were turning the tide. Radar systems improved constantly. Sonar technology advanced rapidly. Improved depth charges carried more destructive power. Escort carriers brought air power to remote ocean areas. Long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic air gap that had previously sheltered submarines. The Atlantic was becoming a killing ground for U-boats rather than Allied merchant ships. The human cost was staggering on both sides of the conflict. German submarine losses meant that 3 out of every 4 U-boat crewmen would never return from patrol. The mathematics of survival were becoming impossible. For the Allies, merchant seamen continued to die in torpedo attacks. But the rate of shipping losses was finally declining. The deadly equation that had favored Germany early in the war was reversing itself. Yet the war beneath the waves was far from over. German engineers worked on revolutionary new submarine designs. These promised to restore their underwater advantage. The Allies, meanwhile, refined their tactics constantly. New weapons entered service regularly. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for another 2 years. But the momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The hunters had become the hunted in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. News of the successful attack on U-569 reached fleet headquarters quickly. Admiral Ernest King and his staff began to understand something profound. The concept of hunter-killer groups was working brilliantly. Small escort carriers operating independently could patrol vast ocean areas. With minimal escorts, they could engage submarines on favorable terms. The success of USS Bogue would lead to additional hunter-killer groups. USS Card, USS Core, and USS Block Island would lead similar formations. Each group developed its own tactics and techniques. All were based on the fundamental principle proven that May morning. Aircraft operating from small carriers could hunt submarines more effectively than anyone had previously imagined. The revolution in naval warfare was just beginning. For Lieutenant Drain and his fellow pilots, the successful engagement was both triumph and sobering reminder. They faced these stakes every single day. They were writing the book on anti-submarine warfare through trial and error. Every flight could be their last mission. Every engagement could end in disaster. They were learning in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The margin for error was razor thin. The technological race was accelerating on both sides. German submarines received improved anti-aircraft weapons. Better radar detectors entered service. New tactics countered hunter-killer group operations. The Allies responded with better aircraft and more sophisticated sensors. Deadlier weapons reached operational squadrons. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological rather than technological. The aura of invincibility surrounding German U-boats was beginning to fade. Submarine commanders, who had once attacked convoys with complete impunity, were now looking over their shoulders. They worried constantly about aircraft that might appear without warning. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic was accelerating. What had begun as Operation Drumbeat was becoming a desperate struggle for survival. The systematic campaign to strangle Britain's lifelines was failing. As USS Bogue headed back to port after her successful patrol, her crew could take satisfaction in their accomplishment. They had proven that American industrial capacity could match any enemy. Technological innovation was making the difference. Fighting spirit remained unbroken. But they also knew that the hardest fighting lay ahead. The waters of the North Atlantic held many more German submarines. These were commanded by men just as skilled and determined as those who had died aboard U-569. Hunter-killer groups would need to perfect their tactics further. Technology required constant improvement. Vigilance could never be relaxed if they hoped to win the longest battle of World War II. Nobody fully understood at the time how profoundly this engagement would influence naval warfare. The lessons learned in these deadly encounters would shape everything from Cold War submarine operations to modern anti-submarine warfare tactics. But in that moment, the immediate reality was simpler and more urgent. Lieutenant Drain's Avenger touched down on Bogue's flight deck. The arresting wire caught his aircraft perfectly. They had found the enemy. They had engaged successfully. They had lived to fight another day. In the unforgiving arithmetic of war, that represented victory. The Battle of the Atlantic was entering a new phase. American pilots operating from tiny aircraft carriers would play a crucial role. They would help determine the outcome of the war itself. What happened next would test their courage in unimaginable ways. Their technology would be pushed to its limits. Their determination would face challenges none of them could have anticipated. The success against U-569 was just the beginning. Summer 1943 brought proof that hunter-killer groups were working. The vast Atlantic Ocean was no longer a safe haven for German submarines, but the enemy was adapting to new realities. What followed would test American pilots and technology in unprecedented ways. Captain Giles Short stood on USS Bogues Bridge as she prepared for her next patrol in early June. Intelligence reports indicated increased U-boat activity along convoy routes. There were disturbing rumors of new German tactics emerging. Some submarines were staying submerged for unprecedented lengths of time. Others were fighting back against aircraft with enhanced anti-aircraft armaments. The war beneath the waves was evolving rapidly, every single day. Each successful engagement provided valuable intelligence about German capabilities. It revealed their evolving tactics, but it also showed how much Americans still had to learn. The ocean was an unforgiving classroom where mistakes cost lives immediately. Lessons were written in blood across the gray waters of the Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander William Drain had been promoted following his successful attack on U-569. But promotion brought new responsibilities, along with greater risks. As squadron leader, he was tasked with training inexperienced pilots. He continued flying the most dangerous missions himself. On June 5, 1943, Drain found himself leading a four-plane strike against a surface submarine. Radar had identified the target approximately 60 miles northeast of Bogues' position. The submarine was U-217, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Kurt Reichenbach-Kleinke. He was a veteran submarine commander with 8 successful patrols behind him. What made this engagement different was the German response that followed. As Drain's formation approached the target area, they encountered something unprecedented. Coordinated anti-aircraft fire came from multiple positions scattered across the ocean surface. U-217 wasn't operating alone in these waters. Intelligence would later reveal that German submarines were beginning to operate in mutually supporting pairs. One boat provided anti-aircraft cover, while the other maneuvered for attack position. The air battle that followed was unlike anything previously seen in anti-submarine warfare. Drain's Avengers faced a wall of flak from multiple 20mm and 37mm guns. They pressed home their attack through this deadly barrage. German gunners were well-trained and disciplined professionals. They turned the sky around their submarines into a deadly maze. Exploding shells and tracer fire filled the air. The coordination was impressive and terrifying. Ensign Robert Martinez flew wing position in Drain's formation. He felt his Avenger shudder as shell fragments tore through the fuselage. His radio operator, Aviation Radioman Second Class James Sullivan, called out damage reports over the intercom. Sullivan continued operating his radar equipment despite the battle raging around them. The professionalism of these young men was remarkable. Most had been civilians just 18 months earlier. The attack succeeded, but at a significant cost to both sides. U-217 was struck by multiple depth charges and began settling by the stern. Her crew abandoned ship as seawater flooded the after compartments. But the supporting U-boat, later identified as U-648, managed to escape the encounter. She was damaged by rocket fire from accompanying Wildcat fighters, but she lived to fight another day. This engagement revealed the changing nature of the submarine war. German commanders were no longer content to simply dive and hide when aircraft appeared. They were fighting back with increasing desperation and sophistication. Each encounter was turning into a deadly aerial duel. The stakes were rising on both sides. The human cost was becoming apparent in casualty reports and empty bunks. German submarine losses in May and June 1943 were catastrophic for their naval command. Experienced commanders who had survived the early years of the war were being killed or captured at an alarming rate. The submarine force that had once seemed invincible was being ground down. The relentless pressure of hunter-killer operations was taking its toll. Morale was declining throughout the German submarine fleet, but the Germans weren't surrendering without a fight. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Admiral Dönitz was implementing radical changes. Submarine tactics were being completely overhauled. Technology was being upgraded rapidly. New boat designs were being rushed into production despite material shortages. Existing submarines were being retrofitted with enhanced anti-aircraft weapons. Improved radar detection equipment was being installed. The most disturbing development was the introduction of acoustic torpedoes. These weapons were designed specifically to target escorts protecting convoys. They could home in on propeller sounds. Destroyer and destroyer escort operations became far more dangerous. Captain Aurelius Vossler had taken command of USS Bogue in April 1944. He understood that the enemy was adapting to Allied tactics rapidly. The easy victories of early 1943 were becoming distant memories. German submarines were learning to counter hunter-killer operations effectively. The psychological pressure on both sides was becoming enormous. American pilots were flying longer patrols over increasingly hostile waters. They knew each mission might be their last flight. German submarine crews were facing odds that made survival increasingly unlikely. Each patrol reduced their chances of returning home. Korvettenkapitän Hans-Joachim Förster commanded U-850, one of the newest submarines in the German fleet. By December 1943, he had witnessed the destruction of dozens of sister boats. Förster knew his own chances of survival were diminishing with each week at sea. The mathematics of submarine warfare had turned against Germany. On December 20th, his luck finally ran out. His submarine was detected by aircraft from USS Bogue while running submerged off the Portuguese coast. What followed was a textbook example of how hunter-killer tactics had evolved since the early encounters of May. Lieutenant Junior Grade Gordon Braslin flew an Avenger from Composite Squadron 19. He initiated the attack with a weapon that represented the cutting edge of anti-submarine technology. The Mark 24 Fido homing torpedo was dropped from low altitude. It immediately began its deadly hunt for the submarine's propeller noise. The torpedo's guidance system was primitive by modern standards, but it was revolutionary for 1943 naval warfare. The torpedo could distinguish between different types of underwater sounds. It actively steered toward its target through the dark water. For submarine commanders accustomed to evading straight-running depth charges, this weapon seemed like science fiction. The torpedo had a mind of its own. It pursued them relentlessly through the depths. U-850's final moments were recorded by multiple aircraft circling overhead. The submarine tried every evasive maneuver in the book. Course changes, emergency deep diving, even attempting to hide in temperature layers. Nothing worked against the Fido torpedo's acoustic guidance system. The explosion when the torpedo found its target was devastating. U-850 broke apart and sank so quickly that only 4 of her 47-man crew survived to be rescued. The technology gap between hunter and hunted was widening dramatically. The advantage was shifting decisively in favor of the Allies. But technology alone wasn't winning this battle. The human factor remained crucial throughout the campaign. The quality of personnel on both sides was being tested to the breaking point. American pilots were flying in conditions previously considered impossible. German submarine crews were facing odds that made survival purely a matter of chance. Aviation radioman first class Thomas Henderson had flown over 100 anti-submarine missions by the end of 1943. His job was to operate radar equipment that detected surface submarines. He also served as the aircraft's rear gunner when necessary. He was responsible for dropping sonobuoys that could track submerged boats. Henderson's description of combat conditions revealed the harsh reality of hunter-killer operations. Flights lasted up to 8 hours in uncomfortable, cramped aircraft. They flew over freezing ocean waters in all weather conditions. Navigation was primitive and dangerous. Weather conditions were often marginal at best. A mechanical failure or navigation error could be fatal instantly. Air crews would find themselves floating in life rafts hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The mental strain was equally challenging for these young men. They were hunting other human beings in mortal combat. The psychological impact of successful attacks could be devastating. Henderson later wrote about watching German sailors abandon their sinking submarine. He knew most would die in the frigid Atlantic waters within minutes. Yet the mission continued because the stakes were so high. Every submarine sunk meant dozens of merchant ships would not be torpedoed. Hundreds of merchant seamen would not die in the cold water. Thousands of tons of supplies would reach Britain and the Soviet Union safely. The strategic situation was shifting dramatically by late 1943. German submarine construction was falling behind losses for the first time in the war. Experienced commanders were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The training pipeline was failing. Most significantly, the technological balance was tilting decisively in favor of the Allies. American industrial production was reaching its peak capacity. Escort carriers were being completed at rates that seemed impossible. German intelligence analysts couldn't believe the production figures. Liberty ships were being launched faster than submarines could sink them. The mathematical equation that had once favored U-boats was reversing itself. But the Germans weren't conceding defeat in the Atlantic battle. New submarine designs promised revolutionary improvements in underwater performance. The type Redefined U-boat could remain submerged indefinitely. It had underwater speeds that exceeded most surface escorts. If these boats could be produced in sufficient numbers, they might restore Germany's advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Dönitz was also implementing new tactical doctrines. These were designed to counter hunter-killer groups effectively. Submarines were being equipped with radar detectors that could warn of approaching aircraft. The boats could detect threats while still submerged safely. Anti-aircraft armament was being strengthened dramatically. Some U-boats carried more firepower than destroyer escorts. The result was an escalating technological and tactical arms race. Every Allied innovation prompted a German counter-innovation. This, in turn, led to improved Allied technology and tactics. The pace of change was accelerating rapidly. Both sides were pushing their industrial and technological capabilities to the absolute limit. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Roberts commanded the Army Air Force's 1st Anti-Submarine Squadron. He understood that the war beneath the waves was entering a decisive phase. His modified B-24 Liberators were flying from bases in England and North Africa. They were closing the mid-Atlantic air gap that had previously provided safe haven for German submarines. The coordination between different Allied services was remarkable and unprecedented. Navy escort carriers provided mobile air cover across vast ocean areas. Army Air Force bombers patrolled from land bases. Coast Guard cutters escorted convoys with increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine weapons. This integrated approach was something the Germans couldn't match with their more limited resources. By early 1944, hunter-killer groups had proven their effectiveness beyond any doubt. USS Bogue alone had accounted for 13 confirmed submarine kills. Her escorts had sunk several more. Other escort carriers were achieving similar results across the Atlantic. The cumulative impact was devastating to German submarine operations. The tide had turned decisively. The human stories emerging from these encounters revealed the true cost of the Battle of the Atlantic. Obermaschinist Wilhelm Hoffmann had survived the sinking of U-118 in June 1943. Aircraft from USS Bogue had overwhelmed his boat with concentrated attack. He was pulled from the water after hours of floating in a life jacket. He would spend the remainder of the war in an American prisoner-of-war camp. Hoffmann's account of life aboard a German submarine in 1943 painted a picture of increasing desperation. Patrols were lasting longer as boats had to travel farther to find targets. Living conditions were deteriorating as supply problems affected everything. Food quality declined. Spare parts became scarce. Most significantly, crew morale was declining as word spread about heavy losses. The contrast with American conditions was stark and telling. While rationing affected civilian life in the United States, military personnel generally had adequate supplies and equipment. The industrial capacity that was overwhelming German defenses was also providing American forces with technological advantages. These were proving decisive in combat after combat. Lieutenant Junior Grade James McClelland had participated in multiple successful attacks by late 1943, but he never forgot his first encounter with a German submarine in March of that year. His depth charges had failed to release properly from his aircraft. The malfunction allowed the U-boat to escape into the depths. The memory of that mechanical failure haunted him through subsequent missions. It reinforced the critical importance of meticulous equipment maintenance. The reliability of American equipment was becoming a decisive factor in the campaign. German submarines were suffering increasing numbers of mechanical failures. Wartime production priorities were affecting quality control throughout their industrial system. American aircraft, while not perfect, were generally more reliable. They could be replaced more quickly when lost to enemy action or mechanical failure. The training pipeline was also favoring the Allies significantly. American pilot training programs were producing qualified aircrew faster than they could be absorbed by operational squadrons. German submarine training was being shortened due to urgent operational requirements. This resulted in less experienced crews going to sea during the most dangerous period of the war. The quality gap was widening constantly. By mid-1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had been decisively won by the Allies. Though fighting would continue until Germany's surrender in May 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Hunter-killer groups had proven that systematic anti-submarine warfare could defeat even the most sophisticated submarine force. The final major engagement involving USS Bogue occurred in April 1945. Her escorts sank U-546 in the closing weeks of the European War. The submarine had managed to torpedo and sink the destroyer escort USS Frederick C. Davis, but U-546 was overwhelmed by the coordinated response of multiple escort vessels. The war's end brought an opportunity for reflection on what had been accomplished. Hunter-killer groups had fundamentally changed naval warfare forever. They proved that small aircraft carriers could be devastatingly effective when properly employed. The tactics and technologies developed during these operations would influence military thinking for decades. More immediately, victory in the Battle of the Atlantic ensured that Britain remained in the war. American forces could be transported safely to European theaters of operations. Without control of the Atlantic sea lanes, the D-Day landings would have been impossible. The entire course of the war might have been different. The human cost had been enormous on both sides of the conflict. German submarine losses totaled over 700 boats, and approximately 30,000 personnel. These were devastating numbers. Allied merchant marine losses exceeded 3.5 million tons of shipping. Over 70,000 lives were lost at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was truly the longest and bloodiest campaign of World War II. Yet from this carnage emerged technologies and tactics that would shape the future. Escort carriers evolved into the amphibious assault ships that dominated post-war naval operations. Anti-submarine warfare techniques developed against U-boats became the foundation for Cold War maritime strategy. The integration of air and sea power became standard doctrine for modern navies. The pilots who flew these dangerous missions returned to civilian life, carrying memories that would last forever. Many struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Such conditions were poorly understood at the time. Their courage and professionalism under extreme conditions had helped win the war. But the personal cost was often overlooked in victory celebrations. German submarine veterans faced different challenges when the war ended. Those who survived imprisonment returned to a defeated nation. Germany needed to rebuild from the ruins of war. Many carried guilt about their role in a regime that had committed unprecedented atrocities. Even though their own service had been conducted according to traditional military codes of honor. The technological lessons learned during the Battle of the Atlantic continued to influence military development for generations. Nuclear submarines, guided missiles, satellite navigation, and modern anti-submarine warfare all traced their origins to innovations first deployed against German U-boats. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. The American ability to build escort carriers, train pilots, and produce advanced weapons faster than they could be destroyed ultimately determined the campaign's outcome. As USS Bogue was decommissioned in November 1946, her career stood as a testament to American ingenuity and determination. From her conversion from a merchant hull to her final victory against U-546, she had embodied the transformation of American naval power. The escort carrier that had once seemed like a stopgap measure had proven to be a war-winning weapon system. Her aircraft had sunk 13 submarines and damaged many others. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the vast Atlantic Ocean could be patrolled effectively by relatively small, specialized forces. The legacy of 1943's hunter-killer operations extended far beyond immediate tactical victories. They represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare. The battleship-centered thinking that had dominated since the beginning of the 20th century was ending. Air-sea integration would characterize modern naval operations. Today, as we look back on these events from the perspective of 8 decades, we can appreciate the courage and innovation of the men who fought this largely invisible war. Their actions in the gray waters of the North Atlantic helped determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. The story of Lieutenant William Drain spotting U-569 on that May morning in 1943 was repeated hundreds of times. Different participants faced varying outcomes in similar encounters. Each engagement was a test of technology, training, courage, and luck. Collectively, these encounters demonstrated that even the most sophisticated military force could be defeated. An enemy with superior resources, better technology, and unshakable determination could prevail. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not by any single dramatic engagement. It was won by the accumulation of countless individual actions. These were performed by ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances. The pilots who flew through flak and weather contributed to victory. The radar operators who tracked contacts through static and interference made the difference. The mechanics who kept aircraft flying despite parts shortages and combat damage ensured success. All contributed to a victory that was far from inevitable when the campaign began. In the end, the hunter became the hunted. The ocean that had sheltered German submarines became their graveyard. The transformation was neither quick nor easy, but it was decisive. By war's end, American control of the Atlantic was so complete that German submarines could barely venture from their bases. They were detected and attacked almost immediately upon leaving port. The young men who flew these missions had fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare forever. Their legacy lives on in every modern anti-submarine operation. Every hunter-killer group deployment carries their influence. Every integration of air and sea power in military operations around the world reflects their innovation and sacrifice.